I believe we're live.
Okay. Well, I'm waiting for it to appear. There we go.
Yep. Hey. So, today, we actually have a pretty exciting thing to talk about. The reason why I'm focusing this stream on Little Bird, which I was not able to say when I originally posted the announcement, because I wasn't allowed to talk about it then, but now I can talk about it, is that the entire Little Bird short is now something you can watch. Um, you have to watch it from inside Fortnite, though, because it is part of Short Night. How you do that, I'm not entirely sure. I've never played Fortnite, but it is among many other things, including a game where you dress up as Batman and run around and shoot people with guns, presumably. It is a game in which you can have a film festival. So there are many shorts in Short Night, and Little Bird is one of them. So you guys can actually go watch it, which up until now it has not been publicly available. Um, And so, in honor of that, we are going to spend, and also because people were asking about it, we are going to talk today about Little Bird rigging and animation. For anyone, I should note, who isn't familiar with what Little Bird is, which actually, could be people, so, I probably ought to have clarified that. Little Bird is the short film that me and Chris Perry did with an Epic Mega Grant. And there were a number of aspects to that, one of which, of course, was producing the short film itself. And the other one of which was developing Unreal tools and an Unreal pipeline for doing real-time, uh, non-photorealistic rendering and compositing. Now that's a topic excuse me, that's a topic I would love to get onto at some point, but I don't think it's something we're going to focus on in this particular session. I should also just note I'm really tired, so if I, seem to have run-on sentences or sort of blink a little bit and lose my train of thought, that's probably why. I
Okay.
apologize in advance for being tired. This is
So
a
if
thing
you
that
if you
happens.
fall asleep, I'll yell loudly. I'll wake
Yes,
you.
yeah, exactly. Yell loudly, and it'll wake me up. Hopefully I won't fall asleep at the keyboard. Um, so here's one thing that I can throw out to our viewers. There's a number of topics about Little Bird rigging and animation that we can talk about. And I would like to know, what it is that you guys would most be interested in seeing. Two of the topics, and one of them that I know people have requested before, is how does the facial rigging work for Little Bird? And how does that interact with the contour-based body rig? And that's certainly, one of the things I intend to talk about. Also, it was all animated with the ephemeral system, so we're going to do a little demo of how that works in the context of this character who's fully in zero G, the whole short, which was actually a really interesting animation challenge, and talk something about what it was like animating that. But I
Well, I should
also,
note,
yes,
Raph. I should note that we in fact got a comment today on our last live stream from
mm-hmm.
Chris Smith saying these tools look great. Please do some face rigging and show the ephemeral rig when you can. Thanks. So
Yes,
very
wow.
very opportune. Good timing there.
Yes, that is extremely opportune. We are about to show some ephemeral stuff. And one of the things I do want to do, and we're not doing that today, but one of the things I really would like to do, maybe we'll even do it with that little alien rabbit dude, since he's pretty simple, is to sit down and actually animate a whole shot on the stream with the ephemeral system. I think that would be really cool. That's not what we're doing right now, but we will talk about it in the context of some actual shots from Little Bird. So basically, yeah, you guys should feel free to throw out in the comments anything you are curious about or want to know about. But I figure,
And
yeah, sorry.
I will note that, Raph and I have been continuing to work on the ephemeral system. We worked on it some over the weekend. We have a lot of things that we're doing. So it's going a little slowly, but it is moving forward slowly but surely. And it's going to become a product. There were some issues figuring out how to make it work with certain aspects of Maya that were pretty
Yeah.
difficult that we think we pretty much have figured out. And I think we'll have an early release of it. I'm not going to put a date on it, but it definitely is going to happen. And we'll have probably an early access program where it's a little bit slower than it really ought to be, but probably still usable for people. And then, eventually I think it will get faster.
Yes.
So, yeah, that's coming. I think it will be a while, but it is coming.
Although it is worth noting that for what it is and how we've written this version of it, it's actually quite astonishingly fast. Given the scenarios, I was just recently using the old Ansevin breakdown tool because I had reason to use a conventional rig, and I couldn't use the ephemeral systems breakdown tool. So I was like, oh, this is still better than a lot of the other ones out there, and I happen to have access to it because it's the Ansevin tool. Yeah, I mean, it's actually and it's much 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 slower than the ephemeral system. No surprise there because of the way that it was written. I believe we actually used right. I mean, that was even before OM2, right? We were using OpenMaya 1, I think. So
yeah, that was well before.
yeah, it was well before, and of course it doesn't play well with parallel eval, etc., etc. It's just very slow. The ephemeral system is vastly faster than that.
It's not that the breakdown tool itself, the Ansevin breakdown tool itself, is slow. It's just that because of the way it interacts with Maya, Maya is slow while you're using it.
Indeed, for a variety of reasons, technical reasons that we probably not our focus right this second. But things that we have largely overcome with the ephemeral system. Anyway, so one of the first things I want to talk about is facial rigging and how her facial rig works, because it is a bit of a unusual approach, but one that I've been adopting pretty widely. And that is that, in a sense, her mesh here serves as that primitive, the rigging primitive that we keep talking about. So to give a sense of what that means, right? I've talked about having the right primitive to solve your rigging problems, right? And the fact that having just joints, which are like Maya joints, are not exactly the same thing as a transform in Maya's terminology, but basically they're just transforms. That Maya joints, or any joint, right? Any just straight up transform is not really a great primitive for rigging most of the time. It's something you want to have, but it's not actually a great sort of base unit to build your rig out of. Splines are a much better option, which is why Contour is able to do all of the things that it does, assuming, of course, you come up with a deformation method that can handle those splines well. But it's not the only option for a good sort of internal primitive to solving your problems for rigging. There are certain things that splines, most body rigging, frankly, that splines are exceedingly appropriate for. But there are other cases where they're less appropriate. So what we're seeing in the case of a face, for instance, a lot of this has to do with, is your deformation problem more like a tube that bends, or is it more like a sheet that stretches? And in the case of a face, it's a lot like a sheet that stretches. You need all of this stuff in the cheeks to stretch. And in the case of a face, you need stuff to, in a sense, shear. So if I just sort of I'm going to turn this on. If you don't want, for instance, a spline running along this eyebrow to take these vertices up here and shift them way off to the side, because they're being deformed by the spline and the tangency of the spline is now at an angle. Does that make sense? Because I am sort of using some spline terminology here that not everyone may necessarily be familiar with, but basically the idea is the spline bends the surface, but because everything rotates with the spline, I mean, that's extremely desirable for any sort of tube-like shape, you would tend to get verts sort of swinging around.
So, by the way, I will mention we have a comment from Ryan Craig, which is, now this is what I've been waiting for. If you look at the picker for some Disney characters, the picker for Little Bird is on par with Disney. So I guess that's good. We should mention, by the way, this is a third-party tool. This is not our tool.
Oh, yes, the picker is MG Picker, which is a well-known picker tool. And I like it. It's something that I often use. There are other pickers out there too, and they work fine as well. But yeah.
But a shout out to MG Picker.
That's right.
It is a good tool. We like it.
So the thing that's maybe worth noting about that, actually, in terms of say the Disney, the Disney's pickers, right, is that one thing you can say though about the Little Bird characters, or really most characters that I make, is there are actually many fewer controls than you typically see in that kind of picker, right? So if you look at one of the Disney pickers, or you look at any picker from a major studio, or not just the picker, you look at the set of controls that's available for your character, there tend to be a very large number of them. And the reason for that is that tweakability is at a real premium, and that they don't mind layering control behavior. I also want high degrees of tweakability, but I want a balance, because I really don't want to layer control behavior as much as I can. I want to avoid that as much as I possibly can. And the reason why I want to avoid that is that you tend to get those situations where your high level controls and your low level controls end up fighting each other. And so an example for that with the this rig is that all of these eyebrow controls are on the same level, right? There's no let me just switch this to object mode. There's no like eyebrow control that moves the whole eyebrow. I actually don't want that, because in the case of the eyebrow, where everything is kind of on the same plane, I mean, it isn't really, like your forehead isn't flat, but in a sense you could say conceptually they're kind of in the same plane. I don't really see much of a need for having layered controls and all of the problems that come with them. And the problems that come with them tend to happen with emergent behavior. I mean, this is also something that we want to solve. The ephemeral system exists in part to solve. Now, it should be noted that while her face rig takes part in the ephemeral system, it gets the same poses and everything, it is not itself an ephemeral, these are not ephemeral controls. They're conventional controls that are being used within the ephemeral system, which is one of the things that it can do. It can have static controls in addition to the ephemeral controls. But there's a lot of sort of similar concepts being used here, where I'm trying to avoid scenarios in which I'm layering different kind of control behavior together. So if I had one control that moved the whole eyebrow, and then tweaker controls underneath that, I'd be producing a case in which those controls could potentially fight each other. And that's especially true when you're interpolating. It's actually a bit less of a problem if you're not interpolating, but then it's rather hard to deal with not interpolating in a conventional rig, generally speaking, anyway. So
this is sort of something of a theme that runs through how you think about rigging, I think.
Yes.
Like with the ephemeral system, I think that's sort of one of the motivating things there is, like, you don't want to like let's say you have IK and you're doing stuff, you don't want to have to like go back and fix an elbow position that keeps moving around. Like you
right.
move one thing and the other thing moves, right? You just want to put things where you want them.
I want to put things where I want to put them. Now, because of the fact, though, that the face is not ephemeral, and eventually I would like faces to be ephemeral too, but that isn't where we've put our effort, because it's much more important, I feel, for the body rigs. There is, I've made a concession to this in a couple of places, and one of these is like at the mouth corner, where you have a specific control that moves the other controls around. So I should note that these controls that I have, like, they're meshes, which is weird. These like weird little mesh controls. The reason for that is that they can show up when you select them and not when you don't. And I find that to be kind of a nice thing, which is why I'm not using conventional curves here. That's not very important. I'm considering whether that's even really what I ought to have done, or whether that was like, I could maybe do something to hide or unhide controls. But it is kind of nice to have the controls, to be able to see the rotation of the control itself, but not have it just be this like whole bunch of curves that are just pasted all over your face and are hard to look at, right? I kind of like this thing where you can select it in the picker and you can see something that represents the actual rotation of your control, or something, but which is not actually, it's not there all the time. It only appears when you select it. And having a mesh with an invisible shader on it, which is literally all this is, it's just like a shader that's 100% transparent, is one way of achieving that goal. So I'm going around here and I'm manipulating this, and mostly I don't have a lot of layers on top. So for instance, one thing you commonly get in facial rigs is like, oh, here's the bottom lip, right? Do you want to roll it out or push it in for an F, or any of these other things you might do with it, and there might be specific controls for that. And I generally don't want that, because I can just select these controls and rotate them in or rotate them out. And yes, it requires a little bit more work. So if I was doing like she's like biting her lower lip or something, it would be something like that. But it's actually not that much more work, right? That's not actually an unreasonable thing for me to do. And it gives me this flat hierarchy of stuff where I don't have a million things like piled on top of each other. I can just be like, look, I'm just going to take all these things on the lower lip. I'm gonna rotate them inward.
So Ryan Craig is asking, would it be different if the eyebrows were a separate mesh?
And the answer is, yeah, in some ways it would. For instance, if the eyebrows were a separate mesh, if that was how we'd done this character, I might well be using contour for the eyebrow mesh specifically, because that's an area where it works quite successfully. So the reason why I'm not using contour on the face mesh in this case specifically has to do with that aspect of, although I could have actually used it just for these vertices right in here where the eyebrow is, but is that this is just a texture. Like in this particular case, the the eyebrow's just a texture on the face mesh. And we want to avoid that scenario where the curve of the eyebrow ends up moving verts over on her forehead around or underneath the eyebrow in a way that we don't like. However, if you have you could still actually use it for eyebrows, and sometimes I would just weight only the really like eyebrow area specifically to the contour chain, and use something else to sort of push these verts around. And also, if the eyebrow is a separate mesh, then I generally do use contour for eyebrows, because it's perfect for that scenario where you're like, here's this line of verts basically, and I just want them to follow a curve, especially if there's a difference between how that eyebrow is modeled and the underlying surface, which is quite common, right? You might have the eyebrow be at a higher density and have a variety of additional mesh details on it than you have on the underlying forehead mesh or whatever. And if they're not congruent, especially then, contour is actually a very good solution for that problem. So eyebrows are one of the places where I do very commonly use contour with facial rigs. However, in this case, it's just a texture, and it didn't really make sense in this case. Although, there are cases where I might do so, because this is basically, as you can sort of see, you can think of this as shearing the mesh. It's just sort of shifting each of these edge loops downward. And that maybe leads to the next thing to talk about, which I sort of alluded to before, but I didn't quite get into it, which is this idea of the mesh itself serving, in a sense, as the primitive. So we're talking about finding the right primitive, and the way that that splines are often the right primitive, but also surfaces are sometimes the right primitive, and I often find that to be true for faces. If I am breaking a face with higher density, I will very often use a wrap deformer, so that essentially I construct a surface with vertices in the right places for my various controls, and then I'll use that to drive the underlying mesh. But if you have a stylized character and you have control over how it gets topologized, you can actually skip that step by simply choosing to topologize the mesh such that it actually matches, more or less, what you would do with a wrap deforming mesh that you would use to deform that face. And again, the reason to use a wrap as opposed to just painting a lot of weights, A, painting weights takes forever and I don't like it, but B, you get a variety of nice qualities out of that. So here's an example of how you get that. So I talked about how you just have these controls and you can just sort of roll them in and out. So let me just show the so normally speaking, I can also translate them up and down. If I was waiting here, let me actually turn it off here and on here. I think that's going to be the most effective thing. If I was waiting, there was a bunch of mesh detail in here, and it was a much higher res mesh, which would be quite common in a lot of scenarios, right? Meshes are usually higher res than this. Then it would be quite difficult for me to get this rollout to work without messing around with the verts in here, because I'd be stuck with a scenario where, in order to get it to move up and down reasonably, I'd have to create a gradient of weights that would go into the chin. But then when I wanted to roll it out, then that would start taking these verts that would, these currently non-existent verts that would be in here, and start pushing them in, because they would have to be weighted, to some degree to these controls in order to get them to look good going up and down. And there are solutions for that problem. You could have, multiple joints that are, following the controls in different ways. But of course, this all introduces complexity. And the goal of this idea of find the primitive that does the right thing for the kind of deformation you want to create is to avoid having to introduce large amounts of complexity and add a bunch of different, not that that's a huge amount of complexity, but it adds up, right? And avoid adding a whole bunch of influences all over the place, so that you have influences that do different things, and do something that's very simple. Right? And if you put your edge loops in the right place for a wrap deformer or something, then you will tend to create a situation where you'll tend to create a situation where that complexity is either necessary if you're using joints, or if you're, sorry, again, lost my train of thought. I told you I was real tired right now. But if you are, so let me back up and say what I think I was saying, which is if you do use the right kind of topology, if you use a wrap deformer or if you topo your mesh the right way, then you create a situation in which instead of adding that complexity, the right behavior falls out of the deformation primitive you've chosen. And that's by far, whenever it's possible, that's what I prefer. Because here you don't have to worry about that so much.
So kind of on that topic, Raph, Ryan Craig is asking, did you use contour for this face rig?
I did not, although this face rig, the head rig that underlies the face rig does use contour, like the next contour. The face rig is not contour, specifically because the way that I'm doing this face rig is, the primary reason I'm not using contour anywhere here at all is the fact that the brows are a texture. Because if the brows were a separate mesh, I'd probably use contour for that. But generally speaking, in facial rigs, contour can be quite effective for certain things, but not generally effective for this kind of thing where you need things to stretch and shear instead of bend. So
right.
The way that
we should really resurrect that ghost head.
We really need to resurrect the ghost head because the ghost head is a great example of where contour is actually very effective for facial rigs.
Right, but it's an extremely cartoony head that has to it does have to move and bend and squash and stretch. Yep. And so contour does a lot of very good things with it. And there are some ways of using constraints to keep things on its surface. And it's got a lot of interesting techniques in it. So we should really bring that back. But
yeah, we definitely should. But essentially, to sort of reiterate what I said before, and I think that maybe I have stated this in kind of a weird order, but I'm making this up as I go along, right? It's streaming is still something I'm a little bit less used to. Because I had the control to topologize this mesh the way I wanted to, as opposed to receiving an existing mesh, instead of making a surface for wrap deformation, I topologized this surface specifically to have the edge loops in exactly the places I wanted them to be for deformation purposes.
And by the way, Raph, Kyle Burris is asking, what is the reason for not using ephemeral on the face?
Okay, so the reason for not using ephemeral on the face is actually twofold. And one of them, and this is no longer as much of a concern, but it was at one time, is performance. So the ephemeral system used to be quite a bit slower than it is now. And as a result, in order to make sure that it was fully interactive, I tended to restrict it to the primary body controls. That's a lot less of an issue than it used to be. The other reason is I haven't yet turned my attention to the question of what ephemeral relationships would be good for this kind of facial rig. And how would you set them up? And so that's something that I think that's something I absolutely want to explore very soon. A lot of my effort has gone into how would you do ephemeral behavior for a body? Because that's, a very straightforward, well, it's not very straightforward, actually. It took a lot of work. But it is a specific question that has urgent, in my view, answers, right? Body rigging is one of the places where having conventional rigging bites you the hardest in terms of your ability to manipulate the character and your need to think of a lot of switches and dials. You may note that in this face, there are not really any switches and dials. There is a bit of layering with this corner control that affects multiple controls, but there is not switches and dials that have to do with how an example that people often do with faces that would be switches and dials would be things like lip sticking, where you're you can turn it on and off. And I hate stuff like that. I would rather do a little bit of counter animation because of the movement of the jaw than I would deal with the question of having to figure out how my rig ought to behave at any given time and how I have to blend into and out of various different modes. So facial rigging, yeah.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about a little bit earlier about, for instance, FK, IK, having to counter animate elbows, all that kind of stuff. I mean, that stuff is such a big deal with body rigs, right? Especially because of the FK, IK distinction and space switching there and all that there's a very strong motivation for the ephemeral system there.
Right, exactly. And so really what it basically just comes down to is where have I put my effort? What order am I going to put my effort into things? That's pretty much what it comes down to. In the long run, I absolutely want to be doing ephemeral facial rigs. It just hasn't been my focus up till now. And because you're always going to have scenarios, I think, where you need some controls that are not ephemeral in their behavior, even though they take part in the same poses that the ephemeral system creates. Static controls is what we call them, will be a part of the ephemeral system for a long time. Even though, gradually I think more and more controls will be shifted into purely ephemeral behavior as I, experiment more with what the right thing is for that. So, one of the things that I really get out of this kind of facial rig is, there's a lot of flexibility. I mean, you can do a lot of stuff with this rig, and you can do it very effectively, and you can do a lot, and you can create a very large number of possible different poses, and you have a fair amount of fine-grained control over exactly how this stuff is going to deform and how it's going to behave. But this rig is actually extremely simple. And that's something that I really prize. Over complex rigging is something I really, really dislike, and that is sometimes necessary. Like, sometimes you really, really can't avoid it. But like, note for instance that I was able to get this very different shape, in terms of like how the mouth behaves, without necessarily having a lot of stuff in the rig that's supposed to like help me do that. Oh, you know what I just realized? I realized that my face on the live stream is actually kind of blocking what I'm doing down here in the corner of the, like, where I'm pulling controls around. Maybe I'll move it like to the other side or something. I can probably do that in OBS, right?
Yeah,
I can just sort of like move it over.
A lot of empty space in the bottom left corner. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So like, yeah, there we go. So hopefully that makes it a little more clear. I was moving a bunch of these little controls around to create this shape. Note that in a case in which there was a lot more complex rigging and complex weights here, or use of blend shapes or use of correctives, you'd probably end up in a scenario where in order to get this very clean shape on the outside of the lips, you would have needed to have a bunch of specialized stuff that would be intended to create that behavior, even though the rig was very much modeled in a state in which, you had sort of like a peak here at the corner of the mouth. But here I don't. And the reason why I don't, yes.
So, Raf, I mean, we can see, some controls that represent transforms here, and we can see some vertices. How much more rigging is there underneath that? What is the scene graph looking like?
Sure. I mean, let's take a look. Very little, actually. When it comes to these controls here, let me bring up the outliner first so you can sort of take a look at that. When you look at these controls, they're pretty much, and so you've got these pads, and that has to do with what's driving the pose. Because essentially this here, the thing that extends things out into a smile, is sort of like, is driving these underlying controls using corrective blend. So that's what these poses, these pad locators are groups are. They're being driven by the smile control. They're the only thing that really is. But if we go back here to the buffer and we sort of ignore some of that stuff, yeah, it's pretty simple, right? We basically just have these controls. And if we look at one that isn't being driven by a pose, I don't know if this one is. It may not be. Oh, no, it is. It does have a little bit on it. But it's all quite simple, right? There's not, in terms of how this control actually controls the mesh, literally, this control has a joint underneath it. That joint is bound to the mesh. Here, let me, of course, I'm in my sort of like ephemeral animation like environment here, and so I don't have the usual menus and stuff up. But here, let me see if I can go get this from the actual menu. Yeah, I just need to switch this to rigging. Oh right, sorry. What am I doing? This was all contour. That is to say, it was a contour deformer. Or did I do something? No, I actually did something where I was blending it in. Okay, so here, there is a little bit of complexity here, where the actual mesh that gets these weights is not the same mesh you're seeing. They're being blended onto it with a blend shape, which is something I certainly do sometimes, and that can be useful. Let me just see which thing is actually doing that.
And what purpose is that serving here, Rev?
So what the purpose that that's serving is blending, allowing me to rig the face in sort of a different context. So we've really got two different things here. We've got the head rigging, and the head rigging is just pure contour. We've got a contour chain in the neck, and we have a static influence or rigid influence in the head, and that's all that is needed in order to rig the head. The facial rigging is a slightly different thing, and so the way I've chosen to deal with it in this particular case, and there's a variety of ways that you could deal with this. This isn't the only option, but the way I've dealt with it in this particular case is to actually rig a separate head mesh and use a blend shape to blend in the face region. So Right. So where are we? There's a bunch of stuff here. Sorry, it's been a long time since I did this rig. Facial rig mesh shape. That's going to be the one that's blended into this blend shape. And let's see where it is in our outliner. Like I said, I haven't actually. This was a while ago when I rigged this, so yeah, it's going to be in here. There it is. So let's show that. And so that's the mesh that's actually got the weights on it. So let's take a look at just that. And then we should be able to paint skin weights. By the way, there's a reason why this mesh is not being subdivided. And I think I should just call this out because it's a little known fact about how open subdiv works in Maya, which is that generally speaking, you really want all of your subdivision while you're animating, at least, maybe not for export, but all you're animating to be happening as a smooth mesh preview, so that it happens in VP2, on the GPU, and does not muddy your scene with a whole bunch of additional geometry, which will slow down your rig very significantly. However, it so happens that the way that Maya handles this is that if that mesh has a connection to anything else in the scene, it will decide, even though, in fact, this doesn't actually change the behavior in the scene, but this is how Maya does it, that it cannot perform open subdiv on the GPU, and must do it in the scene, even though those vertices will never actually be used. As a result, even though I could switch this to 3, and I would for, probably doing some rigging on it, I always make sure to turn off subdivision so that it doesn't slow down the rig. And that's just, a little thing that you have to be aware of in terms of, rig performance. You'd think it wouldn't matter, because it's just being used as a blend shape, and the subdivision polygons here aren't even visible, and you can't even access them. It turns out it actually does matter, and it does affect performance. So you always want to turn that off, unless you're actually manipulating it for rig purposes. I'm hitting 1 and 3 here to turn subdivision on and off. But yeah, I mean, if you look at what the various we have lower lip stuff, these things, that's literally all they're doing, right? All they are. The only thing these are is a bunch of joints that are affecting the lip. So here we were looking at the ones right in here. Let's go. Yeah, not lower lid, lower lip. Yeah, it's around here somewhere. There we go. Nope, that's right. Left lower lip. There we go. So yeah, it's as simple as this. And the reason why it's that simple is because I am constructing the edge loops on this mesh specifically so that I have one per control that I want on the bottom lip. And the reason why it's so easy to form a clean O shape or any of these other elements without a lot of complex rigging is specifically because the subdivision surface itself will sort of dekink that stuff. And again, if I had a higher res mesh, I'd kind of do the same thing. I'd just construct a wrap deforming, a mesh to use as wrap deformation. I'd rig it like this, and then the wrap deformation would drive the underlying mesh. And there'd be a little bit more complexity in that, in part because I would have to do a little bit of extra stuff to make sure that anywhere the mesh was at a corner or something, you wouldn't end up with something that looked very sharp if you wanted to put the lips into this kind of very clean O shape. But if you have the option, and this is mostly going to be appropriate for very stylized production, but if you have the option of topologizing your mesh specifically for this purpose, it makes this extremely easy. And it makes face rigging for this purpose extremely easy, assuming you don't want a whole lot of high-level controls. And I don't want a whole lot of high-level controls. So it really is worth noting, I rigged this entire face mesh essentially from scratch. I didn't use any kind of auto rigging or anything. I rigged it completely, just blank file. And I did it in about a day. And that was really all that was necessary. And I did that specifically because I was constructing the mesh for the express purpose of making this kind of thing viable. Though, to be fair, when I say about a day, that's not really accurate, because it was a day for the first version, and there were tweaks after that. So it's not really fair to say that it was only a day. But it is true that it did come together rather quickly for something that was done entirely from scratch, and that the results work really well. There's really nothing holding me back from making any kind of expression I want. And one of the things I really don't like in facial rigs is or rigs in general, any rigs, right, is where it presupposes what kind of behavior you want. where you've got shapes baked into the rig that make assumptions about what that rig is supposed to do. And I do have a little bit of that here, where it comes to things like that smile control, right? That's kind of like this compromise, where the smile control ends up becoming it's enough of a pain to push all those things around that you do get something out of having this high level control. But I try to avoid high level controls like that as much as I possibly can. And eventually, when I get around to doing the ephemeral facial rigging, things like this will just be an ephemeral behavior, right? You just like grab the corner and you push it up here, and if you're in the right mode, it will do the right thing. And you don't need like another separate level of controls the same way you don't need them with ephemeral body rigs.
It's interesting because I've known Raph for a very long time. Like I've known you since you were about 15.
That is correct.
And it's interesting watching your evolution in terms of this, because I remember when when I first met you and you were doing rigging, and I remember it was actually like Animation Master, right? Martin
That's right.
Animation Master, which you moved to from Lightwave, and it had sort of more rigging stuff in it. And I remember how much you used to do stuff that did presuppose how
Absolutely.
the rig was going to move.
Mm-hmm.
It was something you were very into. You were like, look at this. This is really cool. I can do this, and I get this automatic behavior, and that's awesome. And it's kind of interesting because I don't know. I think I've gone through a similar thing in terms of as a programmer. I try to do, when I was a very young programmer, I used to like doing very clever things as much as possible. And I now try to do as little clever as possible.
Yeah, and that's basically exactly what it is. Like, because what happened, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's an interesting thing to talk about a little bit. What happened is that I first started getting into animation, at a very young age, and this was like when I met Tagore, like we were at UMass Amherst. I wasn't a student because I was 15, right? But like I was hanging around the CKC animation lab, and like I was trying to develop all of this question. And the problem I had was I couldn't figure out why I couldn't figure out why 3D animation was so damn hard, right? It didn't feel like it should be this hard. And you can see how and like we're talking about literally like this was 25 years ago, right? It was 25 years ago. This was a ridiculously long period of time. But I'm still trying to solve that problem. Only now I think I actually know how to solve it. Because at the time, with my limited experience and my limited understanding, I looked at it and I said, well, the problem here is that you have to do too much. The problem here is that the computer's not helping you enough. And so I actually did a lot of work, in Animation Master, which was really ahead of its time in a lot of ways, trying to figure out how to construct rigs. I mean, among other things, and this was, the mid-90s, right? Among other things, it was like mid to late 90s, I'm not really sure, but it was actually possible to construct rigs that were fairly complex and advanced in Animation Master when most animation software that existed at the time didn't even really have the capabilities to do that. So yeah, way ahead of its time. But the issues that I encountered with that basically, and I did this for years, right? I was like, I actually constructed, this might be one of the things you're remembering, Tagore, this auto center of gravity system is what I refer to it as, with the idea that you'd walk the feet through the scene and and like the pelvis would know what to do. Right, it would just sort of follow along. And that's an idea that was kind of in the air at the time, actually. Like, I wasn't the only person working on the idea that you'd have a solution like that. It was a complete disaster. Like, there's a reason why we don't do that, actually, in real life. Nobody ever managed to animate well under those conditions. And one of the things that comes out of that, it was very early experimentation that eventually led me to understand what I think I understand now, is that that was an attempt to parameterize animation, right? It was an attempt to say, like, I have these, not only just like inputs like keyframes, but at this much higher level input. I just have keys on the feet, and then everything else gets derived from that. Where you narrow down your animation inputs to this like extremely narrow band of parameters that you're going to use to like control your animation, sort of puppet it from a distance. And that was an early example of the failure of that approach. And I didn't fully understand the implications until much, much, much later, right? Until I'd done a lot more animation, for one thing, right? But, and I was much older, right? I didn't really fully understand the implications until about 5 years ago, I think. Which is more or less when I started thinking about the ephemeral system, right?
It's well, but I mean, even say 10 or 12 years ago, you had certainly moved away from trying to do so much.
Oh yes, no, I had
Much
absolutely
more,
done so
right?
by that time for sure. I was just like, no, this is actually because the problem is that the problem isn't really that the computer's not helping you enough. The problem is that the computer's helping you in the wrong ways, and actually, it's very detrimental to have the computer helping you when it's not the right way for it to help you. Right?
I mean, you know my thing about libraries versus frameworks in
Right.
terms of programming, right? And about inversion of control and about abstracting too much too early before you
Yup.
understand what you're abstracting. I think it's the same principle, to be honest with you, because the problem is that it locks you into things.
That's exactly
It
what it
takes
is.
control away from you.
I mean, and the problem that immediately came up with any kind of automation of that kind is like, oh, well, you animate your feet through the scene, and now your pelvis is doing something. Is it exactly the right thing? Well, probably not. And the way I assumed this was going to work is, well, okay, so like you've moved the pelvis through the scene, now go and tweak it, right? Because you had the ability to like animate on top of that because it's buffer. We didn't call them buffers at the time. It's parent or whatever was the thing being driven, and so you could still move the pelvis around relative to that. And the problem now is now you're in counter animation hell, right? You're like, well, the pelvis isn't doing what I want exactly, and I need to tweak it. And that sounds like, right, from a naive point of view that I had in the mid 90s, like, oh, well, yeah, but you just offset it a little bit to get it to where you actually want it to be. And of course, this turns into an interminable slog. Like, it actually prevents you from getting any work done, really. It's much, much, much harder than just animating the pelvis yourself, right? As it turns out. And this is exactly.
Rococo, then rubble, right?
Exactly. And so this is a extreme example, like, because this is way worse than conventional, like, the conventional animation approaches that I still do want to move away from. This thing's way worse, right? But it's an extreme example of that, the way that animation technique and the idea of the computer sort of deriving useful information from your keyframe inputs paints you into a corner and boxes you in and puts you in places you can't get out of.
Right. It's like a framework. And the thing
Yeah,
about the stuff that we've been working on is that it's more like a library. It's a set of tools you can use, but it doesn't take over the world, right?
right.
Like it's there when you need it and you can use as much of it as you want or as little as you want and it goes away when you're not using it.
Yep.
Yeah, it's an
But
interesting parallel. I hadn't really actually made that connection quite as directly before, but
yeah, I
I
mean,
really do think it is essentially the same principle.
it really is. I mean, this is something that we maybe want to do a whole stream on at some point. It's a little off topic for this one, but like the connections I think between the ideas behind ephemeral rigging and various like programming concepts. Like we've discussed this a little bit, but like there's definitely a way in which there's a real analogy between ephemeral rigging versus conventional animation and uh, conventional rigging and functional programming versus more imperative programming. Like there's a real like clear there's a real clear connection between those things. Yeah, Happy Horse says managing hierarchy is a universal problem. It absolutely is, and it's a problem in so many places. It's a problem in programming for sure. It's a problem for animators. It's a problem for it's a problem for pipelines, right? Managing hierarchy and the way that the things that are meant to help you end up boxing you in and like actually making your job much harder. Like it absolutely is a universal problem, right? And it's a hard one to solve specifically because those things do help you. And that's one of the things that's actually worth really, really noting, right? It's that the reason why approaches that, in my view, end up being quite destructive, end up being popular, is that for certain sorts of things, they are actually very good. And if they weren't, no one would ever have adopted them. The problem is that people don't have a good sense for when their, at one time, this was actually really helpful thing, turns on you.
Right. They say that there's no problem you can't solve with another layer of indirection,
Right.
except for too many layers of indirection.
Exactly.
Too many layers of indirection can become a fairly big problem.
Exactly. And I would say that your average rig is basically full of layers of indirection. Like it's layers of it's in some cases like 3 or 4 layers of indirection. And this is like one of the things that makes it so painful to deal with. Whereas if you look at this rig, like one of the things I've been trying to get across is that like the actual way that this rig deforms is dead simple. It's so simple. And yet you get such a wide range of control and such an effective way of like controlling and posing the character. And people are like, oh, but I don't have like a nice little control that puts it into like this particular like ooh pose that I like. That's fine. That's what pose libraries are for. Make yourself a pose library of all of the shapes that you made with this that you really like and just use them. right? That's so much easier to deal with than trying to build a lot of awareness into the rig
Well, and it
about.
goes away when you're not using it.
Right, exactly. You're not using it. You just ignore it. And I mean, this is why I detest like foot rolls, for instance, in rigs. Like even in a conventional rig. I mean, a foot roll has no meaning in the. I mean, that's not even true. You actually could make actually if you made an ephemeral foot roll, it would be much better because then it wouldn't be built into your rig, and you could just sort of like, oh, you use it to push some controls around, and that's the only thing you care about, right? That would be much better than your conventional foot roll.
Okay,
But
so we were
yeah,
looking at the scene graph here.
sure.
And perhaps we should go back to what we were doing. We have digressed as we
We
can
have
see.
digressed quite a bit. So all that's going on here, and this is also true of the the lids, is that you have a few things that constrain how these controls move around. So in the case of the lids, there's something in here that's actually they're actually moving along the controls themselves are not, but the joints that follow the controls are moving on the surface of the sphere of the eyeball, and that's kind of a nice thing. And you also have this this sort of over control for the smile. But aside from those two things, the only thing that's going on here is that we have controls, we have joints underneath those controls, and those joints have some weights to this face mesh. And that's literally it. Like if I look at what's going into this face mesh, it's like this is a skin cluster, right? And it has outputs to to a blend shape, and it's got this like face connection stuff and like all of these driven keys. Like this is basically just what's creating that smile control because it's pushing some of these controls around in accordance with the movement of this higher level control. But that's literally it. Like this in terms of the deformation of the actual mesh. Aside from how it gets combined with the ephemeral one, which requires an additional blend shape, the deformation out of this that drives this mesh that produces all of this behavior is literally just a big old bunch of joints being plugged into a single skin cluster. That's it. And oh, that's actually not quite true. I do believe that we actually have a tiny bit of a blend shape on top that just sort of shapes this cheek slightly. So I actually am lying a little bit there, right? There is a little bit more complexity here, but nothing like the complexity you see in a typical facial rig. And yet we get all of this capability out of it. Let me actually just like undo all of the stuff that I did, like tearing the rig apart. And take a look at like this actual shot. Now this shot doesn't have any particularly big transformations of the lips, right? It's a fairly restrained shot. She's just sort of saying this line and having some eye darts and stuff. So it's not like something that requires like immensely complex facial deformation anyway. But it does let you have very fine grained control over those lips, and that's actually essential for a shot like this actually to get the right shape for these. Even though it's like this shot isn't that complicated, but when you look at something like that. Like this, right? You look at like the curvature of the lips and the way that the corners just turn down very slightly. And like this is all really important to just reading this expression, to getting this across. Because she's expressing something very specific in this pose. We've got like, she's like focusing on what she's doing and she's not unhappy about it. But she's like really, really focused and really like, that thing where you're like, this is a difficult problem, and you're like grimacing slightly. I probably do this all the time. I don't know what my own face looks like when I'm programming or whatever. But I'm just like, is this quite working? Right? And she's got that thing. And getting that across and having the ability to make the little tweaks that are going to sell that expression is really important. Being able to do that simply, without a lot of complexity in the rig is really, really, really excellent.
So, Ryan Craig is asking, will the ephemeral rigging have more face rigging options, or would you use this blend shape method instead still? I do more stylized characters and find all of this very interesting. So thanks.
I do think that we should add some, explore some ephemeral face rigging options. It isn't the priority right now, but also it's worth noting that how the deformation behaves under ephemeral controls really has nothing to do with how the ephemeral system itself behaves. So when I'm talking about this method, I assume when you're talking about the blend shape method, you're talking about the fact that I have an alternate rig that's combined at the end with my contour, rig for the neck and like head connection. That could be you could do it that way underneath an ephemeral rig. You could do it that way underneath a conventional rig. The ephemeral rig doesn't care, which is actually pretty important. The ephemeral rig just says, here's where my controls are. What happens after that, that's your problem, right? The ephemeral rig makes no assumptions about how that needs to work. So we could take this exact rig, and if I had ephemeral behavior to add to it, I could take these exact controls and put ephemeral behavior on them, and it would work perfectly well. It wouldn't matter what you did under the hood.
I suspect that the answer on release, at least for the ephemeral system, will have something to do with how much Raph winds up wanting to do facial rigging ephemerally between now and then. Because if he wants to do it, he will investigate it and he will come up with those things. But I would also say that, I mean, I think, like I said earlier in the stream, we'll get out an early access version of the ephemeral system. We will continue building on that because right now we have, what do we have, Raph? Like about 8-ish, 9-ish ephemeral relationships, essentially.
Right. We have a whole bunch of them. We have a bunch of different types of ephemeral constraints. And it's worth noting that there's absolutely nothing stopping anyone, once we make this public and people can use it, from choosing to do whatever kind of relationships they want, as long, of the various types of relationships, the ephemeral system could use between ephemeral controls. So people can totally experiment and see if they come up with stuff that works well for facial rigging. Nothing stopping you from doing so. I just haven't done it yet. Right.
But the other thing is, we may I think we will be adding new constraint types. I mean, one thing, for instance, the ephemeral system doesn't have yet is true IK. It has sort of a 3-point move. And that's partially because Raph's just more interested in cartoony characters. But certainly that's something that we will add well before we even put out an early access.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that is definitely something that I think we want to have pretty soon. So since we're talking about the ephemeral rig, maybe it's time to move on from the facial rigging and talk about the body rigging. Although, I don't know if I've given people a full picture of how this works. Our approach here to discussing it was a little scattershot, for which I sort of apologize somewhat. I know you were mentioning, Tagore, seeing the whole node graph. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to, see the whole thing and make any sense out of it. But hopefully I got across part of how this works, part of why it's simple, and part of what makes this something that you can both use quickly and is also really effective for animators.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions about how this facial rigging works, this would be a good time to ask.
Yep, it would be a good time to bring it up, and I'm happy to keep discussing this and answer more questions. So I'm going to just wait a second in case anything appears on the the place where people chat their stuff. Yeah, no, I don't want a software update. What are you even talking about?
I think it's often referred to as chat.
Chat. Yes, no, that's right. Of course, people always call it chat. So if anyone has anything to say in chat, I'm giving you a minute to do that, but otherwise I'll probably move on. Body rig is where the fun is at. Sometimes that's actually kind of true, in the sense that facial rigging in a conventional way is sometimes kind of a slog, right? But I don't find that to be true for this type of facial rigging, right? Part of the point is I didn't want it to be a slog. Let me load up a shot where she has more body rigging stuff going on. Because, she obviously does do some body in that shot, but there's not a whole lot. Here's a case where it's the ephemeral system. Here, let me just switch to the actual real-life camera that we're using here. Here was an example of something where the ephemeral system was much more instrumental to the shot. This is one of these things. One of the things that we faced all the time in this production is she doesn't move like somebody in Gravity. Right? And a lot of the assumptions behind a conventional rig kind of assume you've got characters that are walking around and stuff. And of course she's not doing that.
This is kind of a great test case for the ephemeral system.
It absolutely is, right? It's she's flipping upside down and then she makes contact with one of her legs, but she's not putting weight on it in the same way that you would normally. I mean, she is a little bit. Because the concept behind this shot, which is, not necessarily evident just from looking at the shot itself, but should be evident in the actual story, is that the elevator's decelerating. And as a result, she's actually getting a tiny bit of gravity towards the ceiling. And so she puts her foot there to just sort of stop that for a minute, and then in the next shot, her feet just come right off it because that tiny bit of gravity has been removed after the elevator comes to a stop. Actually, animating characters in 0G is actually really difficult. Not necessarily because it's I mean, it could be in a conventional context, actually very painful to figure out how you should actually do that with your rig. The ephemeral rig makes that pretty easy, but there's also a really hard part that's all of your assumptions about how movement works are all wrong, right? So one of the things we kept fighting is I kept animating stuff where it felt like she was swimming a little bit, or she was decelerating when there's nothing that would actually decelerate her, and it didn't really feel like 0G. And so actual 0G animation is actually really, really interesting, I think. Or there'd be an inclination to have her dive through a movement or something, which again, it's why is that actually happening? Right? There's no medium there to dive through. There's nothing to make her or gravity, so there's nothing to make her push off a wall and then have an arc. you push off a wall in 0G, you go in a straight line. Let me just make sure I didn't bump things and turn off my audio. You guys can still hear me, right?
Raph, I am not sure that we can hear you.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, that's what I thought. This mic has a button that on the top that mutes it, and it's very easy to just like hit it with your elbow or something. So what I had been saying was that, I mean, there's nothing to make your movement arc, right? You know, you push off a wall in 0G, you just keep going in a straight line. And so all of your assumptions about how things should work are all wrong. And you know, it's both frustrating, but it's actually a really interesting animation challenge, I think. But for things like this, for instance, like here's how you would sort of do this with the ephemeral system. Like one of the really nice things that I could do. Oh yeah, let me activate the ephemeral system. That's kind of important. Nothing ephemeral is going to happen if I don't do that. Just dock it on the side here. This is the new ephemeral system. And actually, it occurs to me that this is the first public place where we've ever shown the newest. Well, this isn't actually the newest version. We actually have a whole bunch of stuff that we're playing around with in, you know, the really most recent versions that is not, you know, I made sure to use a version that was well tested here. So, you know, hopefully nothing's going to go wrong.
You may want to move your portrait back to the right-hand side.
Oh, yes, that does seem important. Because now, let me like put it over there. Maybe that'll work. Yeah, that seems like maybe a place where it's not going to interrupt anything important. So this is all important, right? So, I mean, one of the many things that you can do here, I've selected the neck. And if I go into backwards all mode, especially if I turn off isolate rotation, I can rotate the whole character back from the neck. And stuff like that is, of course, quite nice when you're doing this character in 0G and you need to like do all of these kind of complicated transformations. And one of the things that you face a lot when you're doing this kind of thing in conventional rigging is like, well, I need to get a character into this pose. And you want to be able to pose as quickly as possible. Like, in a sense, that's your, you know, I have one of my blog posts from kind of a long time ago talks about like the animation core loop in the sense of like it's almost like a core gameplay loop where it's like, oh, I want to manipulate, like the loop is like I need to manipulate the character, you know, but then, you know, get it into the pose that I want to see. And then the other part of the loop is I evaluate that. Does it look good in context? Is it achieving the ends that I want? And if it's not, you need to modify it further. That's basically going back to the top of the loop. And the faster you can do that loop, the faster you can animate, the faster you can try things out. And if I had to take a conventional rig and get here, I'd have two options. One is I'm in FK mode, still kind of a pain, because if I want to do something like this, I'm going to have to probably move the pelvis first, right? Because if I can think about, like, I'm doing this, like, in FK, like, I'm going to have to, like, oh, that's, here, let me switch into all mode, because that'll do, like, this would be more like that, what that would be, right? And I'm like, oh, I wanted to sort of swing her lower body around, I'm going to have to do this and try to make them match up, and, like, it's a whole painful thing, right? If it's an IK, it's even worse. Because then not only do I have to do that, I then have to individually put the hands and the feet and stuff every place that I want. And I am probably going to tweak that. Like, I am probably, you know, like in any given pose, I'm going to like pull these around a little bit and make them work well with the arcs and stuff. But it's still really painful to have to be like, all right, I'm going to just like put it there, and then I'm going to like put this part here, as opposed to being able to just swing the body back from any point that I want to. I mean, I could completely like pivot the whole character from the hand if I want to. Right? That's a thing that's easy enough to do with the ephemeral system. And then refine from there. And so that seems in some ways like a slight thing, right? It seems like, well, I mean, it's not like you can't push the things where you want them to go, but it matters tremendously when you're trying to get as fast as you can to evaluate the things that you're looking at. So like now we've got like this thing that's popped out, which is probably a good place to sort of talk about other aspects of what sort of the ephemeral system does that make this so much easier. And I'm actually going to show some stuff here that we actually didn't use on Little Bird because we hadn't coded it yet. So I did stuff kind of analogous to this for Little Bird, but I had to jump through more hoops to do it. I had to use the sliders instead of using the in-between and re-in-between tools because those didn't exist yet at that time. I was doing something very analogous. I just had to do it multiple times instead of doing it once. But like, here's an example of how you'd handle this kind of problem. So I've now like swung the character way out from where the character was originally. But I have a whole bunch of these existing poses. Now, one way I could do this would be to blow away these poses and just make new breakdowns. But I might not want to do that because maybe there's some things from these poses I want to keep. Maybe I want to keep what the arm's doing, but I want to change what the body's doing. Well, as a matter of fact, there's absolutely a way for me to deal with stuff like that in the ephemeral system. So I would I'm going to turn off blends use all nodes, because that basically means that when I'm doing this in-betweening, this re-in-betweening, I'm only affecting one node. And I'm also going to, actually, one thing is I'm going to put up some onion skinning, because otherwise it can be quite hard to visualize what's going on here. So let's see.
And I do just want to add a cautionary note, Raf. Not that it is an issue right now, but just in general. Remember to call things out if you're using hotkeys.
Yes, very important. I probably have been using hotkeys all the time because, again, with a big part of the ephemeral system's purpose being like, I want to be able to like animate as quickly as possible, and I want to be able to change my modes and behaviors as fast as possible and without even really having to think about it. And now my fingers just know what the hotkeys are. Which is sort of the intended behavior for sure, but doesn't necessarily make a very good demo because you guys have no idea what I just did. So I will try to either call it out or do it through the UI so that it's evident what I am actually doing here. So if I wanted to keep the arm motion, for instance, but re-in between the body motion, yeah, all right, I was bringing up some onion skinning. This tool is the onion skin renderer. It's by, I may well mispronounce his name, and I apologize. Oh boy. And now I'm actually blanking a little bit, and I really apologize. I am terrible with remembering names, including ones I probably can't pronounce. I'm just going to look that up, because I feel like I really need to give this guy credit. He's, like, done really tremendous work. And then I will try to pronounce it properly and probably fail.
And onion skinning is really, really tremendously important to how you animate.
Oh, it's tremendously. I see. I was actually confusing him with a different guy who's also done some nice work that I like. But I can probably pronounce this Lendenfeld's name correctly. His name is Christoph Lendenfeld. And his tool here is actually very important to me, specifically because it's essentially, we had sort of our own onion skin tool at Animating Studio that, I think Brian did a lot of work on it, but you may well have written a bunch of it too, Tagore. I don't recall.
Nope.
No, that was all Brian. Okay.
All Brian.
And it worked, and it was great. Like it was a huge benefit to my workflow, but it never was going to work because of the way it was written. It was not going to work properly with VP2. It would have taken a lot of work to make it work properly with VP2, and it was a little slow. It actually had to save stuff to disk as actual images, as hardware renders, to display them in the viewport. And this was not going to work in the future, like once VP2 got introduced. You can tell how long ago this was by the fact that I'm like, oh, and then VP2 came along. Because, before that, we did not have VP2.
Right, and I don't think in VP1, I think probably the approach of that onion skinner was about as good as you could get in VP1.
Oh yeah, in VP1 that was pretty much your option, right? You really didn't have a better way of doing it. In VP2 you do have better ways of doing it.
Brian actually did some heroic stuff on that.
He did.
It was not easy to make onion skinning happen in VP1.
It was very, very difficult. I will also note that, and this is, for if anyone from Autodesk ever listens to this, I just want to point this out, right? Maya theoretically has onion skin tools now, but they do not actually work. They are not usable at all, and I really, really wish that they worked properly because they would be able to handle camera movement properly. Which one of the issues with using the onion skin renderer, and this is inherent to its behavior, there isn't really a way around this given the way that it functions, is that it can't handle camera movement. So what I typically do is I will make possibly multiple onion cams, and what those as you can see the new pose I made there. What the onion cams do is to basically give me a static camera somewhere along that camera's movement range that I can use for onion skin purposes. And then, in order to check it with the actual camera move, I'll switch back to the camera view. It's not ideal. It's still hugely better than not having onion skin tools because onion skinning truly gives you a view of how your animation actually functions in a way that no other method does. I have also several blog posts on this subject. Let me make sure I'm actually selecting the whole character here. Let's see. Yeah, we want to make sure to get all the pieces. We're going to add selected. Probably going to adjust the global opacity a bit. Yes, thank you, Maya. I need to deal with that at some point. I just haven't felt like it. The ops change callback thing. Yeah, there we go. So here's your onion skins. So you can pretty clearly see where it goes out of line, right? But you can also see how these things line up. And that's very important for being able to see how to do things like secondary animation. And if I ever do a full demo of animating with the ephemeral system on the stream, it'll become very evident how I use that. because it lets you actually see how your poses flow together in a way that other methods simply like don't allow. Even motion trails, which are certainly better than a graph editor, like really don't give you the full picture of that. And one of the really nice things that the onion skin renderer does is allow you to display things in this outline mode. And there's a number of modes. I mean, you can display a shaded mode, but that's kind of hard to look at. Like, it's better than nothing. But and sometimes this is useful when you're dealing with stuff like in a face or whatever. But you do have to kind of tease this apart with your eyes, which is not ideal. You can do a shape, which is better, but I feel like it's still a little hard to look at. What I really like is the outline mode, because I feel like this gives you a very clear idea of how your pose silhouettes relate to each other. And what it's doing basically is it's taking a render of your character every time you alight on that frame. Right, it's doing that through VP2 and it's storing it independently, and then it just displays it for you as needed. It's very, very nice. The only real issue with it is that lack of camera movement, and that's pretty inherent to the way he's doing this. And I do think there are probably some ways to make an onion skin to render type tool that would allow for camera movement, and that would behave in a somewhat similar way, but you would have to take a different approach to it. But anyway, so let's talk about what we're doing here. So we've got the character, and we're saying, let's say we want to actually do this, and we want to do it based on his torso, her torso, I should say, or her chest, or like however you want to put it, right? And we want to use that, and like that's going to trace through the scene, and it's going to take other things with it. So I have this in all. I'm putting my interaction mode in all, which means everything else will follow along with the one I have selected, and I've turned isolate rotation off so that limbs will basically act as straight FK. And I'm going to go, and let's hope this doesn't break. Because we are, this is alpha software, every time we do a demo of it, I'm always just like, I hope nothing rad happens. I mean, I've done quite a lot of animation with it, I'm pretty sure it won't, but there's always that, thing. I'm going to in between this section. So I've selected a section of poses, and it's worth noting that while these are represented as keys, really conceptually, they're full poses. As opposed to like individual keyframes in the way that Maya usually thinks of them.
That's an important point, and I think actually we should call that out a little bit more. So the poses have extent in time.
Right.
That is to say that from the point that a pose happens, right up until the point that another pose happens, it is still in that pose. And these tools are aware of that. If you do something on a frame that does not have a pose, it will act essentially as if you were on the pose of, So the keyframes are how we have to express that in Maya, because that's how Maya works. But conceptually speaking, these poses are blocks of time, not points in time.
Right. So anyway, I'm in-betweening this, and it's going to go through and change her pose so that it ends up fitting with this. Well, actually, I think I didn't quite get all of the... Yeah, I didn't quite get all of them, which is why that didn't actually work.
The following is an important...
No, that's not... No, it's not actually an important message. Sorry, I clicked the wrong thing.
Are you still there, Raf?
Yes, I am still there.
Okay, you are. Okay.
Sorry, no, a message came up. I see. I think I see. I see why it's not doing that. So it's not actually connecting. So if I were to re-break down this, yeah, it has to do with what that thing is actually relative to. Here, let me grab the pelvis. Yeah, there we go. So here's what's going on here. So what I have done, and the reason why that didn't work in the case of the from here, and this is actually an issue that I want to solve, and that I think is going to be quite easy to solve, is you'll just have a little toggle that says which type of behavior you want. But the breakdowning, to answer Happy Horse's question, what space is the breakdowning happening in? It's happening in the space that the ephemeral system decides that it will happen in, based on your modes. So what's happened here is I've taken the pelvis and basically had it said, like, so this pelvis is going to move through the scene. Nothing else about the animation is going to change. I have just in between the pelvis so that it matches up with where I decided that it should go from there. And now it just sort of like lines up with this this behavior that I had created. But note how this now causes the torso to kind of wiggle around and like kind of have some motion in there that I don't particularly like. So that's a very normal issue to have anytime you're going about, like, you know, changing the behavior of something sort of up the chain, right? This is a classic animation problem. I changed how the pelvis moves, and it was kind of an FK type situation. Therefore, the torso is not doing, you know, kind of has like a weird motion. And if this were a conventional rig, I'd be kind of stuck now, right? If this were a conventional rig, here my options would be limited. I could, I could sort of counter animate that with the torso, or I could switch it, bake it to like maybe an IK mode or something, or like switch to an IK mode and redo the torso, or like something like that. It would be really awkward. Like conventional rigging does, and conventional animation doesn't have a good answer for this problem. The ephemeral system, on the other hand, has a great answer for this problem, which is I'm basically going to change my mode. So instead of being in all mode, I'm going to be in default mode, which means that I can move the torso around independently of any other aspect of the character's motion. And then I'm going to go through and say, oh, well, you know, where it has that really weird bobble that I don't like, well, there's a variety of things I could do. One of the things I could do would be to in between that section. So note how it's going through and now changing that so that the torso's movement, even though nothing else has changed in the rig, I haven't actually switched into a different mode or changed anything about how the rig behaves, is now smooth. Another option that I could have used, and like let's take a case here. So here's like a case that kind of happened because of how I did that, where like what she's doing there with her torso is like a little bit halting, because of like the range that I selected when I in between. I can go through and explicitly smooth that down by doing a smooth over time, again in default mode, so it just affects the torso. So that the torso is independent of anything else, because in default mode the spine is IK.
And so default mode, Raf, is you have, for all of these various ephemeral controls, they have different behavior types depending on the mode, but they all have,
that's right,
basically, they all fall into sort of a default behavior for that body part, basically.
That's right. So each one of the things that you define when you're creating an ephemeral rig is what's, you know, in default mode. Because default mode is the idea of like, okay, well, all other things considered, how should this control behave? Right? What's sort of your default behavior for this control? And usually it's IK, but you can actually set it to be whatever you want. So for instance, you may note that the shoulders, for instance, did in fact go along with the torso in default mode, because they're set to always go along with the torso in default mode. Because you don't normally want the shoulders to be like totally free. You do want them to follow along, whereas the arms did not, because you want them to behave like IK in default, as a default. So that's all sort of configurable. And one of the ways that you can think about the ephemeral system is that it's all about configuring stuff. Where you're basically like, instead of saying, here's an explicit graph of my rig behavior, like, here's some explicit relationships, they're always going to be evaluated through the rig, these are connections in the scene, you're saying, here's a bunch of what you might say is like configuration data, or like, it's configuration. You're basically saying, you know, it's rule-based. Under these conditions, this is how the control should behave. And these other conditions, this is how the control can behave. And you just define your behaviors. You define what relationships your control should have under these different conditions. And essentially all of the ephemeral behavior just gets created from that, meaning you're very free to just sort of like and change that stuff, or you know, or sort of just have things behave in whatever way you think is appropriate for different modes, right? That's sort of all under your control. But as you may note here, now there was that little bobble and now it's gone. And one of the things that's maybe worth noting here is that this makes polish so damned easy. You know, like conventional animation polish is so painful. Here you can sort of spot correct little things, and you can change the space that anything is in just by changing your modes.
I will note, Raf, that we have some comments piling up.
Yes. Let me sort of address some of these comments. So Ryan Craig says,
Okay.
I wish there were more tools like TFM, for example, that could make facial rigging easier. I do too. There are a lot of reasons why we ended up abandoning TFM, and a big part of it did actually have to do with parallel eval and the way that Maya was changing. Because in order to, this sort of goes along with what was going on with the onion skin tool, which is that when we wrote TFM, this was well before parallel eval was a thing and VP2 was a thing. And as I recall, Brian had to do some ugly stuff to make some of the stuff that we did in TFM function. And it was stuff that made a lot of assumptions about the Maya node graph that were not true under parallel eval. I think you and Brian may have taken a look at this somewhat recently, and so you might actually have a better memory for this than I do, Tagore. But that's what I sort of recall happening. And so when we looked at it,
it's hard.
Yeah,
it's
when
hard.
parallel eval happened, when we were looking at that, we were like, this might be a significant rewrite. It wasn't just like updating the tool for a new version of Maya. This was something
I
that
think it
really
would've
required us to conceive.
The other thing,
Yeah.
the other thing about TFM is, and I want to be a little bit careful about how I phrase it, but that's very, very old code, and it is not easy code. It is not easy code to work with. So yeah, I think that's what it's said about it. I do think that it would be really interesting to take another look at facial rigging and to
Absolutely.
actually ask, can it be really rethought? Kind of, I don't know that it needs as much of a ground up rethinking as we've applied to, say, contour in the ephemeral system, but I think there are some ideas probably. I don't know that this is the time to really go into them, though. There are some ideas that I think could be really good. Hopefully for us, things will start to open up a little bit and we will have some more resources to devote to other things. Right now, we're really, really busy just with contour in the ephemeral system. But hopefully we will have some more resources to start devoting to things like that. I really hope that happens.
Yep, and you're not the first person to basically say, like, this is all great and this new technology is really awesome, but how are we animators who are less technical going to be able to access it? And we addressed that a little bit with sort of our earlier, our contour demo from last week, which was like, actually, it's not out of the bounds of possibility for someone who's not really that familiar with contour to actually make a contour rig from scratch, even if they're not super familiar with rigging. But it certainly is true that there's that aspect to an auto rigger TSM or TFM for faces, where it's like put some stuff in there, hit a button, right? Where that's a lot more approachable to people who aren't that familiar with rigging concepts. And
we may want to take a look at having some things that can do some auto rigging that combines, for instance, contour in the ephemeral system. I think that at some point that's probably worth thinking about, as much as you dislike auto riggers.
Right. Well, it's worth noting that I dislike auto riggers specifically when you're creating something where the intent of the auto rigger is that you be able to rebuild stuff. I'm perfectly fine with sort of auto scripts basically that generate some rigging for you with the assumption that what exists in the Maya scene is actually your source of truth. The thing that I really hate about auto rigging is dueling sources of truth, right? And and that's the thing I really want to avoid. But if
there's some stuff that could be done about that, I think, but I think this is probably not the time to discuss it.
Right.
But we could move on. And Happy Horse is saying this default mode seems to be where the juice is at, and you can address that, Raf. But I would say, the default mode itself is essentially like a single rig, right? It is kind of like having one static rig. So the juice is having the default mode and then having all the other modes that you can switch.
That's right. So here's an example, in default. If I'm manipulating the body, right? So here's an example. So here's one of these examples where I'm like, I'm gonna rotate back from the torso or something, and I'm gonna have full control over the spine. So default mode is not just one mode. If I go into backwards mode, so now I'm rotating the whole spine back from the torso. Note that the feet are still pinned in place. They are still behaving in quote unquote IK. It's actually pseudo K, but it's an IK like behavior. And what's going on with that is that because I am manipulating the spine, and that's the limb I'm manipulating, and I'm not manipulating, I'm in backwards, not backwards all, it's going to keep other limbs in their default mode. So the important part about that is basically being able to say, well, all other things considered, this is how I want my limb to behave. And it's going to behave that way a lot in response to stuff I do with the body that isn't directly manipulating this limb. And so that's really nice. But here's the example. So I'm doing this, here's backwards mode, here's backwards all. So I'm hitting Alt X, which shifts me into backwards all mode, which you can also see up here in the UI. Note that this now moves the whole legs, moves the legs around too in an FK-like way. Because now the legs are being controlled backward from the spine. They're not in default mode anymore. And so the whole purpose of the modes and the way that they interact with each other and various different things here is that there's a lot of cases where you really want to have a wide range of of things you want to do with your character, but you do not want to specify all of them from scratch. And I think so this is actually a really nice aspect, and maybe one of the core aspects of the ephemeral system, actually. One of the things that separates it from some other similar things that people are doing, which are also actually very cool. So like, let me not cast any aspersions on like, other people's approaches to this problem. But this is one of the things that the ephemeral system does rather uniquely, which is it's context sensitive. All of the behaviors that you're getting from it are things where instead of saying like, okay, here's a mode, and I'm going to have to define everything's relationship to everything else in this mode. Instead, you have a much more limited set of configurations that options that you have that define what kind of behavior your nodes can have. And this means,
One way to think about this is that, if you build a rig, it has certain behaviors. And then a simple example of like wanting to have more than one behavior is to do sort of space switching type stuff, right? Or and FKIK switching and all of that. What the ephemeral system basically does is based on a whole bunch of things, what you have selected, what mode you're in, some other things. It is essentially building a rig on the fly for each of these that's different for every different combination of those things. So an ephemeral system essentially unpacks into literally millions of potential rigs, probably in a complicated setup, right? Like when you add up all of the permutations of all of those things, and you might, a lot of those are probably pretty useless to you. You would never wind up using some combinations of things.
Sure.
But the thing is, you've got a very large space of rigs that you can essentially just switch between at will, right? That's kind of the point to it, right?
And like the example that I bring up a lot has to do with like reverse foot rigs. I mean, obviously, let's go to a frame where she's standing on something, kind of, quote unquote, standing on something, right?
I do want to just maybe take a look at a few more of these comments, though, just so we don't get.
Oh yes, absolutely, because we're getting a little backed up there. Yes.
Yeah. So Happy Horse also said, does default mode change as you change which control is selected?
Yeah, so I think maybe we kind of answered that before, but I think a good way of putting it is that the default does not change. What all default mode is actually, is something that says all controls are in default. All controls have a default. They may use their default in other cases, essentially anytime the system isn't telling them to do something else, right? So like the example of why the feet remained pinned when I manipulated the spine in backwards mode, is because I was in backwards and not backwards all, so it didn't apply to the whole character. At no point was I telling the legs to do something else, so they did what I told them to do by default, right? So all default mode is something that says, oh, all controls just do default. And so it's pretty analogous. Like I also have an explicit IK mode. And the way that differs from default mode, I hit V to enter IK mode, is that some other things are pinned that are not pinned in straight default mode. So like the neck, the head is pinned. Because in IK mode, the head explicitly like remains pinned because sometimes you really, really want that. And similarly, like in IK mode, if I go and I lift the foot, it's going to keep the toe pinned. It's not going to be if I was in default mode and I lifted the foot, I'd lift the whole thing. So their default essentially just says, yeah, all other things considered, this is what you have. And default mode just says everything's in default. So does default mode change? No. And defaults don't change either, but the actual behavior of any given thing may well change because the ephemeral system may be explicitly saying, based on the modes you have, oh, you're in forward mode now. So now if I go select this knee, or actually if I select this knee and I say now I'm in forward, now the knee behaves in FK, right? And if I go up to like, this is like very normal FK behavior. But if I had the knee and I was in default mode, which again, like I hit A to switch into default mode and I hit W to switch to my move tool. And now I'm actually moving this around, completely independently because that's what knees do in default mode, at least in this particular case, right? Because this is pseudo K and not IK. If this was IK, the knee wouldn't stretch like that, right? And if I switch back to forward mode by hitting Z, now I'm just moving the whole leg around. So the way that I animate with this, it really is this thing where I just have my fingers over those keys, and every time I need to do something, I just hit the thing that I need and I go do that, right? Extremely, extremely simple and easy to use. There is, however...
essentially, a complete new rig is getting built based on a combination of the mode, some of the checkboxes, and what the selection is.
Right, that is essentially what you can think of it as. Although I think it is worth noting that when people say, like, you build a rig, they tend to be thinking about this in terms of, like... the rig is, you're building a rig in the scene. Like, you're building a rig out of nodes that are analogous to Maya nodes.
We're not
the
putting
case.
it in there. You can say, though, there is an abstract scene graph that's underlying all of this, and this sort of abstract scene graph, which is not embodied in any in any Maya stuff, right? It's completely our stuff, but it is getting rebuilt essentially every time you do that.
Right.
So Happy Horse also said better visualization of things probably helps people understand the mode that the current rig is in. It can be unclear to users what exactly would move when you move a control.
Indeed.
And I will say one thing that we really want to do is add some better visualization. That's on our agenda, and we're doing some refactoring of the code that will make that a little bit easier. So things like being able to have controls change color, for instance, based on relationships between things, and visualization so that you basically just look at the screen and you can see what's happening. And that's actually something that I think is really important. One of the things I like about Contour, for instance, is most of what's driving behavior is actually visible, like on screen, at least when you have things unhidden, right? Like,
Right.
as opposed to like, with a, one of the things about the ephemeral system is that is less true. Just like the scene graph is hidden from you in a complicated rig, the ephemeral graph is this thing that's getting made all the time, right? So it's also, it's really hidden from you. So having something that visualizes the important parts of that and just the important parts of that, I think will be really powerful.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing. It's one of the most important things for us to address next. So, to answer another question from Happy Horse, so you had to switch the mode on the leg first and then move the body in backwards mode to move the leg with the body. Actually, no. I think that actually it's kind of an important point that that's not actually what happened there. Because at no time in the ephemeral system do you ever switch modes on a particular body part. And this was actually something that's very important to me. Because if you did that, you would need to be thinking about what mode the different body parts were in. And in order to remove that cognitive load, I want it to be completely you're in a mode, and what that mode's behavior, like what it does, how you manipulate things based on that mode, changes depending on your selection. So it's context sensitive. But you never change a particular limb or set of controls to a particular mode. You only change the global mode. The thing I had to switch was not to switch the leg. It was to switch from backward, which only affects the limb you're currently manipulating, and everything else is default, so that would be like the spine, in this case, and switch from backward to backward all. So now it's affecting the spine and anything else that sort of flows backwards from that, such as the legs. And so I'm always controlling the mode and the options that affect everything at once.
And the thing about the ephemeral system is that it is basically stateless. That is to say, it's not stateless. It is in a particular state. But when you change state, nothing about the previous states that you have been in has any effect on anything, right? You only have to think about the current state that you're in to know what the behavior is going to be.
That's right.
And that's a lot of the point to it.
And nothing ever sticks around that would confuse. The only thing, here's the thing that can stick around, of course, you might not realize what mode you're in. And that's something that we think better visualization will make a big difference there. You'll be able to see with color coding or with some other, sort of UI method, exactly how your various controls are going to behave.
And jumping ahead a little bit, Happy Horse is saying, there are two backwards modes, right? There's backwards and backwards all.
That's right. And that's what I was switching there. So to answer another one of Happy Horse's questions, yeah, I think I understand the hierarchy is changing in the custom compute graph. Just managing what things are pinned and at what time is the tricky part, and you made it look easy. So I think that the important point here is maybe that I didn't make it look easy. It is easy because there are simple rules for it. And that's exactly the heart of what we were just talking about. That you don't have to manage what things are pinned on any individual basis. You're never expected, like the way you are with FBIK, say, you're like, I'm going to pin this hand, or I'm going to put this shoulder into some, this is the other mode the shoulder's in, and this is how it's going to react. And all that stuff is a break on how fast you can manipulate things and how fast you can think about them, right? You're always fiddling around with this one is this, and it's and that's true of a conventional rig as well, right? You're always what mode is it in, and how is any particular control, what space is any given particular control in, and a big part of the point of the ephemeral system is that you never ever have to switch any actual specific control or set of controls to any particular mode. You are always only globally switching things, and so when you choose to pin things, all that really means is I'm in a mode where these things would be pinned. If I'm manipulating the spine and I'm in a mode where so forwards, backwards, default, any of these modes where I'm only affecting the limb that I'm currently manipulating, then all other things will be default, which will pin them. Assuming you have set the default to them being pinned, which is what I usually do, right? The defaults can be other things, right? All other things are going to be default. If I'm in a mode that affects multiple limbs, like backwards all, forwards all like all of these modes that are intended to manipulate larger portions of the character, then that's not the case, and they won't be pinned. But it's just the question of what mode you're in, and that's the only thing that you need to deal with.
Okay. So Happy Horse is asking, do you see more modes in between backwards and backwards all?
Not at the moment. What we have here is most definitely incomplete. Like, I would be astonished if we didn't eventually discover additional modes that would be important or meaningful, right? That people would really want. So I'm not going to say categorically, yeah, there's no modes in between backwards and backwards all. But I will say that the nice thing about backwards and backwards all is that they're super simple. Oh, I see what you mean, as in backwards to heel but not toes. So what you might get is, conceivably, and this is something that might be worth thinking about, is a mode that's like backward one level. So it's like you've got multiple limbs here, and you're going to go like, one level out. I'm a little leery of that, and the reason why I'm a little leery of that is I do think that that's starting to introduce too much cognitive, configuration, like too many different things to think about. And one of the things I really, really try hard to do with the ephemeral system is limit that. And part of that, and this is actually a really important principle, I think, of the system, is anything that's easy to do is easy to redo. So a classic example here, and like let me actually do this. So if I was re-in-betweening the whole character for a section, which is totally a thing that you can do, and I or if I just blow away some keys and decide to in-between. So let's say we're going from here to here, right? Blow away some poses, I should say, they're not really keys. And let's say I'm going to in-between them. I'm in forwards mode, but I'm affecting all nodes. And I'm going to subdivide by 2. Or actually, I'm not going to subdivide by 2. I'm going to do per frame by 2, which means that I am in-betweening every other frame. And I did that in forward mode. The classic both good and bad thing that you get. I mean, obviously, this doesn't look particularly good because it doesn't really fit this particular motion, but for purposes of argument, this is what I'm doing. And the problem that you tend to get with that is that everything is in an arc, which may very well not be what you want. Like, look how this hand is coming up and around in an arc. Well, maybe you didn't want that. So instead of having something where it's some sort of configuration of like, well, I want to do this thing, but I'm going to put the hand in default mode, or I'm going to put the hand in like IK mode or something, and then I'm going to do my in-between. I don't like stuff like that. I think it's a lot more thought. You instead of I'm going to put thought into what I'm about to do, and then I'm going to do it. I do a thing, and then I see if it's what I wanted, and then if it's not, I can just redo some part of it, and it's super easy, right? So in this case, what I could do is I could re-in between this section, turning off blends use all nodes, so I'm only affecting the hand, and switching to default mode, so it's an IK. Or just explicitly switching to IK mode, like same thing in this particular case. And then I re-in between that section. And now, instead of swinging out in an arc, the hand's moving in a straight line. But nothing else changed. And the really important part about that is that I'm always reacting to something that's actually happening, instead of trying to guess what's going to happen. So instead of going through and saying, I need to do this operation. I'm going to like switch a couple of things. I'm going to switch some switches and dials because I think that's going to do what I need for this operation. But I need to think about what each part is doing, and then I'm going to go do it and see if I was right. Instead, I just switch to a mode, which is one very simple thing. I do the operation, and if any part of it isn't what I wanted, I just redo that part. But I'm always reacting to something that's actually happening. I am seeing something on screen that I want to change, instead of thinking I know what I want to do, even if it's not necessarily obvious.
I'll also mention something, and this is very speculative, but it's something that I've thought about a little bit, and I don't know if how much I've talked even to you about it, Raph, but I do see the potential, and this is definitely not something that's going to be the case when we first put the ephemeral system out, but I see the potential to give people the ability to build their own modes. And I think there are ways of decomposing some of the things that are in the ephemeral system that would allow a lot of user customizability of it and allow people to build their own behaviors. But like I said, that is language. How does it work? That is very speculative, and it's not going to be in the first release of Rituals.
Sure.
I mean, of the ephemeral system.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at how the ephemeral graph itself works, it can support a very wide range of things. Like, you can think of the modes as being a sort of a level on top of the graph's behavior itself, defining what all of the possible relationships are. Theoretically, you could define them in other ways. and give people a lot of control over how they were going to define those things. Yeah, absolutely. But I do think
it's kind of a UI problem and
Right.
like how to get it across problem. It's not an easy thing to make comprehensible.
Right, exactly. Like, one of the things about the behavior of the modes and the behavior of the graph is that this is stuff that, like, actually the logic for this stuff, like, the intent is for its behavior to be really self-evident, right? Once you use it a little bit and you get used to it, you're like, oh, I know what node I need to be in to do this. I'm just going to, like, fly around to different modes and, like, do, it's all going to work the way I expect, right? The intent is for, from the point of view of the animator, for everything to be, like, super clear and transparent. But from the point of view of how this logic actually works internally to the system, it's actually really complicated. Like, there's parts of stuff in there, and there's work that we can do to sort of make that more comprehensible or simplify it, maybe simplify the algorithm in some ways. But, like, it's actually much more complicated than you might imagine. And that's
in some ways, it's pretty elegant in its way, though. It has a certain mathematical simplicity to it, too.
Yes.
And that's why I think it could be sort of pulled apart and given to people in very small pieces that could be put back together in ways that would do what, things that we have not envisioned. It's just a matter of figuring out how to cleave those things and how to give them to people in a way, right, that's going to be understandable.
Well, I was specifically thinking about the behaviors and how they relate to the modes. So, like the graph itself is really quite elegant, I think. The behaviors and the modes, there's some complicated logic in there, and that's one of the things that's hard to make comprehensible,
But I do think that there are some, I mean, this is probably not the time or the place for it. I think that is something that could be rethought.
Oh, absolutely.
Probably distilled into some simpler principles. But this is not the time.
I mean, I completely agree with that. And, like, we've certainly had discussions about that, about how it would be really good to be able to go back and readdress that and see if there's simpler underlying concepts that could simplify the algorithm. And I absolutely think that there probably are. We just haven't really turned our attention to that yet. We have so many things to turn our attention to, right? So anyway, I think it's about time to wrap up. It's after 5:30. Does anyone have any final questions about this?
So I have a question, Raph. Do you think that next time we want to continue looking at the ephemeral system? Because there's a lot to show about it, and I don't think
there really is. There's a tremendous amount. Like, we really scratched the surface here only, and I do think that the right way to do that is going to be to animate something, like, just like animate something on stream, and with the ephemeral system, it will make it really clear to people, like, how do you use this system? What are the effects that it has? How do you expect it to behave? Like, that's something.
Maybe not next time. Maybe another time.
That's right. Maybe not next time, though.
Maybe we won't make up our mind about it quite yet.
One of the things that I might like to see in next time, I'm actually sort of thinking about this, especially because this is like Little Bird Week, right? I do know that people, and this is not explicitly a notional pipe thing, but I do know that people have been really curious about the Little Bird Unreal tools. I think it might be worth taking a look at those.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds like a good idea.
Because we really haven't shown them publicly that much. And they're intended to be publicly accessible, like, unlike the notional pipe tools, which are, very much commercial products. The ephemeral tools, the Little Bird Unreal tools are going to be open source. And actually the main thing that's holding me and us, in this case being me and Chris rather than me and Tagore, from releasing them open source is that they're pretty much undocumented. And if we drop them open source now, it would be like, hey, here's the stuff you have no idea how to use, and good luck with that, right?
I mean, that's how a lot of open source stuff is, Raph. I know, I'm not suggesting you shouldn't document this, but boy, I have been plowing through a whole bunch of other people's libraries this week, like reading their code, because that's how you figure out how it works.
Yeah, well, in this case, I think it would be even harder because there isn't even any code to read. Like, this is all blueprints. And so it's like, I mean, you can look at the blueprints, actually. But I sort of feel like without knowing the intent behind it, it's going to be really hard for people to figure that out just by, like, trying to read the blueprints. Blueprints are in some ways harder to read than code, actually. Even though, they're more approachable in some ways because they're a visual programming language that also tends to obscure some of their behavior, right? It's a little bit less evident than it is. And you don't have all the nice tools that IDEs and, things that are not actually IDEs but are somewhat IDE-like, give you of being able to, like, jump around in the code and sort of statically analyze it and figure things out about it.
Yeah, I have to say that, and blueprints are very nice and visual programming is very interesting, but I do have to say, like, nobody has ever really figured out a way to beat text as a programming medium.
I mean, there are absolutely things that blueprints are great for. Like, I'm certainly not saying that that's a bad approach. And it's very true, for instance, that specifically for Unreal, like I would not have seen us actually being able to do Little Bird, because it's worth keeping in mind, like, and I hope this, like, it's worth keeping in mind, like I animated every shot in Little Bird. I also rigged everything that went into Little Bird. There was plenty of stuff that we did during Little Bird where we were enhancing the ephemeral system in part in response to like stuff that I wanted to do for Little Bird. And I also did all the tools development for Little Bird. Had I been trying to do that tools development in C++, that would not have happened, right? That would not have been possible. At the same time, there's definitely, well, you could say, like, well, it would be nice if there was some sort of language that was sort of intermediate there, where you weren't dealing with the whole Unreal C++ API, but you had something a little higher level, but you also weren't dealing with visual programming language. I mean, there's other possibilities that maybe could exist.
What is that called? What is that called? That scripting add-on.
That's right. Which actually, as I believe, Epic bought. So presumably, it's getting integrated into UE now.
They did buy it. Skookum.
That's right. So there's definitely like interesting other possibilities here for sure. But so I will say, like, there's a lot of things that I like about Blueprints. It is absolutely true that once you reach a certain level of complexity, and this is very related to all of the stuff that I've been talking about like, yeah, keyframes are great until you reach a certain level of complexity and then they suck, right? It's kind of a similar thing. It's like visual programming is really, really clear until you reach a certain level of complexity, and then it becomes really hard to understand. Much harder than conventional programming, assuming your code that you've written is not terrible, right? Obviously, you code can be arbitrarily terrible and hard to understand. So, it depends on how you wrote it, but,
It certainly can. I mean, there are certain kinds of abstraction that I think are hard to put into a visual programming language as well.
There absolutely are, and blueprints are like, they're very imperative. They're very like, they're very they have all the stuff that you'd expect, the loops and conditionals and like, all kinds of stuff you can't do with the Maya node graph, for instance. All of the like, basic programming, sort of pieces that you'd expect to have. There are definitely sort of higher level concepts that they really lack, and that I don't think they were ever designed to really support. And I don't think it would make sense for them to support them necessarily, but yeah.
So Happyhorse is asking, what about UE control rig system?
So I really want to take a much closer look at the control rig system. I am only sort of very familiar with it on a surface level. I do think it looks really, really interesting. In the sense that, and I sort of talked about this a little bit, when I was getting into my real rants about auto rigging with the Pirate, that it really looks to me like control rig in UE does something that I've wanted for a long time, which is that there's no division between scripting your rig and your rig, right? I mean, part of the problem with auto rigging, and we've talked about this a whole bunch, is that you have these two sources of truth. You've got your like script that makes your rig, and you've got your rig, and like, figuring out like what's, like there's so much temptation to like go move the rig around, and then the script can't do anything, and like, you have all of these complexities and issues. And in control rig, it's like your script is your rig, right? You have much more of a programming environment, right? To create rig behavior. And that's not some separate thing. And it is getting compiled to something under the hood, I'm sure, right? But you don't, unlike in the case of Maya, where you can say like, your auto rigger compiles to a rig, but then the rig is actually manipulatable, which is not normally how that works, right? Your sort of rig functions and stuff that you can make, in control rig, you sort of have like a rig function that's like, well, this is how I'm doing IK, or this is how I'm doing like some aspect of my rig that can just be called in various places in your rig. And that's like, that is, in my view, like a far friendlier way of thinking about control rig behavior than the way that we do things in Maya. So, I don't really know when I'm going to have the chance to really dig into control rig, because since the ephemeral behavior and contour and everything is on the Maya side, so much of my focus is on animating in Maya and then exporting stuff to UE, right? I will say, though, that there's a lot of things about control rig that I think are really excellent.
Yeah. I will also say that we are in general pretty bullish about UE.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that we're going to start trying to devote more attention to. Basically, especially, Raf's done all of this work with Little Bird, of course, but something that's been on my mind. I have been doing some more stuff with UE, sort of because I've been so buried in Maya for so long that I've been having to kind of like come up to speed a little bit on that. But I mean, one of the things is, for instance, I would really like to see Contour run in UE, and that's something that it's going to happen at some point.
Yeah, it's something that we really, really want. I mean, Alembic, the whole pipeline. I mean, Alembic is nice in that it separates everything down to this very narrow band of data, and that's nice. But as a practical thing in your pipeline, there's a lot of issues with it, and a lot of that just has to do with speed. Like getting Alembics out from Maya, reading them into UE, turning them into geocaches, it's slow, and that's not conducive to fast, fast production, which is one of the things we really want. So this is like a very having your full deformation happening directly in UE, which would probably also mean some kind of subdivision surfaces in UE. So there's a lot that would go into that, right? But it is a very desirable thing, and I think it's absolutely something that's going to happen. It's just a question of when. I mean, heck, if we could do like ephemeral behavior with a rig that was deforming fully in UE, like I'd be very happy, right? I'm not really tied to Maya explicitly at all. And, there's absolutely like other possibilities out there that I think will become more and more realistic, as time goes on. I mean, right now we're still in a case where Maya being a central thing in your pipeline is still really hard to avoid. I don't know that's good. That's not going to be true forever, right? So anyway, I really do have to get going, but thank you very much for coming to our stream.
Thank you all for coming by, and thank you all for all of the questions and comments. And Happy Horse is saying, I don't know what is happening with ozone deformer, but maybe some collaboration while people even use the particle system to do dual quaternion skinning.
Yeah, I mean, ozone is absolutely one of the things that could facilitate that. We've definitely been looking at that. Right now, sort of what the right approach is going to be is a little bit up in the air, but like I'm really excited about the stuff they're working on for sure.
You've talked with them a little bit.
Yeah, I have a little bit, and it's something that we're really interested in. That may well turn out to be like the way that ends up happening, like moving more deformation onto the UE side. Among other things, ozone does in fact do open subdiv for you in UE, and that's actually a really important thing. That's a really important stumbling block that we fix right now. Because to me, subdivision surfaces are really important. And it's a lot of like the stuff I was showing with the face earlier. Like all that stuff depends on having decent subdivision surfaces. It's understandable that UE doesn't support them natively because they're really an entirely different sort of mode of thinking about meshes. Like in UE, meshes are made out of triangles, right? And which makes perfect sense for a game engine, right? But there's sort of the idea that you can have different kinds of surface types, like that's the sort of in Maya, like stuff that you do with like smooth mesh preview is technically like polygons, but like in a sense it isn't really, right? It is in terms of how Maya's sort of structure, but it's really a subdivision surface. Like it's really something other than a polygonal surface. It is more analogous, even though it has many characteristics that are more appropriate than NURBS are, but it is more analogous to a NURB surface in a lot of ways than a polygonal surface. And so, yeah, I mean that's really a new thing for UE, right? That's not what your game engine normally does. So we will see what direction those things go in, but yeah, absolutely. I think ozone is very possibly like the direction that things go. And they seem to have thought about a lot of this stuff, very, very deeply, and I'm pretty excited to see where they go with it.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up then. Yeah. Thank you all for coming by. Like, subscribe if you.
Yep, that's right. You have to like and subscribe. That's very important. If you think that this, and stream,
I believe there is a bell that you can hit to get.
Oh, geez, can you? Yeah, do that.
You should mention the bell too. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell.
And hit the bell. I guess. I don't really know what that does, but I assume that hitting the bell is probably a good thing. So you should do that, right? And then the other thing is, yeah, I mean, if you think that the ideas in this stream are valuable, like this stream's going to be up on YouTube like in like 2 seconds or whatever. I don't really know like how long it takes you to put it up there. Like, share it with people. Like, tell people about it. Like, we would love to have people like viewing this and being exposed to these ideas, and like you guys can help with that.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Yep.
And thank you and goodbye.
Yep.